second speaker is Slava Foss, and the same rules, half an hour.
Half an hour. And I promise I will take more time to surprise positively. So it's thanks again for conference organizers to put.
How do you get those guys to do activism?
Well, don't ask me. This is. We'll get there. Yes, I'll tell you. So it's really great to be here in this conference. Great to be back in Israel, and it's really amazing to be in this room with all of you here because you will see. It's kind of, I have to apologize that paper has really two big disadvantages. First of all, I need to present it after Robert, and I'm not going to deliver same quality of presentation, I know. But the second main disadvantage is that it's heavily theoretical paper. And I will try to do my best to minimize on that. I will not torture you with any proofs, but I will need to show you some equations, but mostly we'll focus on what these equations mean. It's really great actually to present after Robert because I don't need to motivate the paper. The paper is about, as you see from the title, activism, and we all understand that this is an important topic, trading in financial markets and liquidity. So we'll basically take what we talked about, price efficiency, effort expanded by activists and financial markets, and we'll put all of that in one place. Now, the paper is joint work with Kerry Beck, Pierre-Colin Defern, Taoli, Alexander Lundquist. There is a long history for this paper, but as you know, you probably know some of them, they're heavy, hard-working theorists. We needed that to basically do what we're doing. But I will try focusing on economics. So again, I will spend a few minutes on, again, motivating activism, why it's important. All activist hedge funds, we know them. The media pays a lot of attention. They make money. They make a lot of money for shareholders. And in academic literature, there are many papers started with Alon et al. And people who basically spend a lot of time on studying activists, as you can understand also from the program. Many firms experience engagements with activists. Very often, this is these are behind-scene engagements. Very often, these are direct, conflicts that result in proxy contest. Many firms, even if you look at large firms, go through that process. Now, this is a very similar plot from my paper with Pierre, but basically Alon and others et al. Showed it earlier that, why we like activists, because they create value. When we look at stock price reaction to activism events, there is quite a lot of value creation. I, in my research, focused a lot on the bars here, on abnormal trading activity, basically. What happens in financial markets? How that information about value creation by activists makes it into prices. And we know, fortunately, there is a nice disclosure requirement from activists. They do say how they trade. But still, there are many interesting questions. So in this paper, basically, I will focus on the linkage between effort expenditure by activists, by how hard they're going to work to create value, and market conditions. And here, we need to understand something that, again, as I said, stock price reaction is usually positive when they come in. In my data, and it's very similar to what Alon has, they on average accumulate about 7% stakes. So these are large stakes in firms. And it's really important to understand the business model of these guys. They make money on buying shares at price that does not reflect the full long-term value. So from their perspective, having liquidity in financial markets, having the ability to trade on prices that don't fully reflect information is crucial. So this is exactly what we are going to try to link in this paper. We're going to think very carefully about the linkage between what activists do and how they trade, how much money they can make on trading. And why it is important, as Robert already said, there are basically, it's endless debate on the legal side about what we should do with activism regulation. Should we push it in the direction of limiting the ability of activists to trade, or we maybe should do nothing? And this is why I think this paper is important, because we will take that very seriously. We will be thinking very carefully about what such a change would make to activists. Would it make them basically create more value or less value for shareholders? And just recently, there was a proposal to shorten disclosure window from 10 days that we have now to 2 days. And nothing happens yet, but again, the debate is there all the time. And again, there is always the trade-off that people have in mind. price efficiency, economic efficiency on the one side, and fairness on the other side, right? Basically, people who say that maybe we don't want activists to trade too much, they say that people who trade with activists, they lose money and maybe someone needs to protect them. So this is exactly where our model is going to go into. We're going to study all these interactions. Now, we are, of course, not the first. And as in many places in corporate governance, it actually started with legal scholars. Coffey wrote a paper, a really famous paper in '91, saying that if you ask whether stock liquidity is good or bad, actually the answer is maybe not what we expect. He argued that if you think about a blockholder who already has a large position in the company, enhancing stock liquidity, helping them trade more easily, actually can be bad for incentives to intervene and improve firm value, because then these blockholders can just sell shares and exit very quickly. So he argued that stock liquidity does not necessarily have positive effects on governance. Then later in '98, Ernst Moog published a paper in GF saying that actually we need to think really carefully about the initial block formation. He said that if we endogenize initial toehold, if we don't assume that activists have a large block, if we instead let them choose that, actually what we're going to see that activists strategically are going to choose small initial toeholds, and then later on they will be benefiting from liquidity. So he basically overturned these predictions that said that stock liquidity is good for governance. Now, all these arguments, actually all the remaining theoretical literature that came after that, is based on a very simple, and again, for modeling reasons, model of activism. In all these papers, activism is a one action that someone takes that changes firm value by a given amount. So suppose I take an action, I'm able to take over the board, then firm value will go by $1 billion. This is what people think about, this is how people think about activism in these models. Now, of course, what we're going to do, we're going to say microstructure in these models needs to be much better, because we cannot just assume that firm value is exogenous. Firm value really depends on what activists are going to do. If activists are going to fight really hard, if they're going to spend a lot of money on what is going to happen with the campaign, they actually can change probability of success. Moreover, the resulting change in firm value can be larger. So the main change in this paper is that we're going to take a classical microstructure paper, Kyle 85, in a dynamic setup. And instead of working with exogenous firm value, we will let firm value depend on how many shares activist is going to accumulate. And this way we're going to link financial markets and how many shares activists can actually buy with economic efficiency and impact of activists on firm value. Now, how we're going to do it, and this is one of main points of the paper. Instead of thinking about activism as just a binary action, that I do something and the firm value goes up, we're going to actually ask, is it really done that way? And when we just went through some outcomes, it actually does not appear to be exactly that. So of course, sometimes activists want to change policy, so which is something like continuous. Suppose they want to increase payouts. So if you pay out $1 billion versus $10 billion, it will have different impact on firm value. So it's clearly a continuous outcome. If, for example, you try to influence, and there are recent papers on that, outcome of an M&A deal, maybe the final outcome is binary indeed, that firm will be either taken over or not, but you can influence probability of success in the continuous way, and we're going to see that it will change some outcomes. Of course, sometimes outcome is clearly binary when you want to fire a CEO, but again, the effort is not. You can work very hard on firing someone, and you can just write news article on that and don't spend a lot of money. So basically, in this paper, we're going to think very carefully about production function. This will be the key ingredient here. We're going to say that many results that people have in mind will change once we generalize production function. Let me now spend 1 minute on telling you what is that result. Basically, if you go back to this to Moog 98 paper, And this is what, again, goes to many other remaining papers. There is that well-known lock-in effect. And the idea there is that everything crucially depends on the toehold size. If activist endogenously chooses small toehold, then something happens, and liquidity is good for governance. If activist chooses large toehold, liquidity will be bad for governance. We're going to show you that that result is basically completely driven by production function that was assumed in these models. If we leave the world of binary impact of activists on firm value, that results disappear. And actually, I will be showing you that for many types of production function, especially when we think about continuous impact on firm value, initial toehold will be irrelevant if we want to think about implications of stock liquidity on activist effort. So this is quite important result because actually it also means that we maybe instead of thinking about initial toeholds, we actually need to start thinking about what activists want. We need to focus on that. And this is one of, I think, main contributions of the paper. Another contribution of the paper that, again, we're going to see later from equations is that because the model is dynamic, you're going to see it, there will be feedback effects from what activists are doing to liquidity and then to trading. These feedback effects are not there in one period models. And we're going to see that like this simple intuition that, for example, if we have more noise trading, liquidity is better, like Benny, what you're referring to. These intuitions will go. They will leave, and actually we will be able to generate results when more noise trading will have a negative impact on stock liquidity. Why? Let me just give you one preview of intuition. Because if there is a lot of noise trading, if, for example, someone is selling shares aggressively, activists will be able to buy. But because in equilibrium, effort expended by activists will depend on how many shares activist has, that fact that activist was able to buy many shares will be a source of adverse selection in the market. Market participants will be really worried. And just to give you one example, suppose you know that for some reason Carl Icahn was able to get a stake, a 7% stake in a company, because one of index funds was just willing to sell everything. Market participants will be really worried. What is going to happen now? Okay? It's very different when you sell shares to Carl Icahn versus you sell shares to someone else. This is exactly what we're going to see in our model. Okay, so let me now go probably to, I will not spend too much time, but let me just show you setup of the model. Some of you can just have tea and coffee if you want. And then I will jump a few slides. We will go to results, basically what model delivers. Again, it's a continuous time model, dynamic model, where activist trades from period 0 to period t. Activist is going to, activist is going to expand private cost, okay? And after that cost is expanded, firm value will be changed. Again, in this paper, firm value can start from 0, but it can be any positive number. The idea is that activists will increase it by V. And of course, you can already see that the willingness of activists to spend effort will depend on his stake size. Because if I change storm value by $1 I will, per share, I will benefit more if I have many shares. So this is how stake size will enter the model here. So this is, again, this is the value of the firm that activists will set. This is his private cost, and this is cost of buying shares. So again, every period activists will buy theta shares and then pay equilibrium price P, okay? The final stake will be initial stake of the activist plus all shares that activists accumulated during the trading period. Market maker is standard as in Kyle model. Market maker basically observes cumulative order flow and then makes inference from that. What is really new here, and it wasn't in Kyle model because in Kyle model it was irrelevant, market maker here will need to form beliefs about activist stake size because it will be really crucial. It will affect his inference about firm value. Basically in this model, activist stake size will be source of adverse selection. If you note it here, we shut down completely the classical kind of information that is there in Kyle model. Activist does not know anything exogenous about firm. So we're not saying that activist just knows that dividend will be higher than someone else knows. Activist basically here is going to change firm value, and this is going to be his private information. We have a different paper with only Pierre, where we do have two types of information, where activists know something about exogenous variables, and also activists can change firm value, and results are quite similar, but that model needs to be much simpler. Okay, and again, price formation is standard. Price is also always a conditional expectations of terminal value. And again, information here is order flow, cumulative order flow up to that point of time. So again, what is going to be firm value? This is Vx. It will depend, hello Eugene, it will depend on how many shares activists accumulated. And we actually can, let me show you a few examples, because this is basically where activist technology will kick in. This is where it will matter, okay? And let me go through a few examples. So suppose that cost function is quadratic. So basically you can either create value or destroy value, and it is symmetric. In this case, firm value will be linear in how many shares activist was able to accumulate. As we're going to see in this model, I will not be able to talk about economic efficiency because things will be symmetric. Activists can destroy value, can create value, so many things will not matter, but it will be a nice benchmark. This is probably the most interesting example that I will be using sometimes. Suppose activists cannot destroy value, can only create firm value, and when activist creates value, then the cost function is quadratic. In this case, firm value will be like an option payoff as function of activist stake size. If activist basically is able to buy shares, and he will work hard and increase firm value. If not, then nothing will happen, okay? Because cost here is infinite. So many intuitions that I will be explaining will come from simply value of option. We know that option value, for example, increases in uncertainty about the underlying. Let me skip this example. So there is main theorem, and if you're interested, you're welcome to read it. Let me spend 1 minute on this point here. Again, in this model, there will be a very important amplification effect I already mentioned. Usually, if you think about Kyle model, informed trader buys whatever noise traders are going to sell. Here, it will be very different. Because whenever activist buys one share from noise trader, activist will actually want to buy more shares. Why? Because when activist bought the first share, he knows now his stake is going to be larger. He is going to work harder. This is basically, this way activist knows that firm value will be even more valuable, so activists actually buy a little bit more. So that amplification effect will be the key driver of that result that I described, that sometimes increasing noise trading activity will actually have a negative effect on market liquidity, and not positive that we have in all our basic models. Okay, let me now go through some things, but let me choose what to do with you. Yes, yeah, okay, so now let me spend the remaining time talking about the key question. What is the relationship between market liquidity and economic efficiency? And I think this is what regulators really need to be thinking about. And the message of our paper will be that it's a little bit complicated. It's not the way we usually think about it. Let me explain slowly why. So we're going to measure economic efficiency in a very simple way, just expected price, expected firm value. And price efficiency we're going to measure using average price impact. First result, and this is really important, that you know, when you read empirical papers, and many in this room have done it a lot, and I spent many years on writing and reading these papers, is that people say, let's study the effect of liquidity on X, okay? So one of the results in this paper is that these questions are not that legitimate. Liquidity here, price impact, will depend on many things. For example, price impact, of course, will depend on noise trading volatility. Price impact will depend on uncertainty about activist position, and this is where disclosure rules can come in. Price impact will depend on how many shares activists had in the beginning. Price impact will depend on productivity of the activist. So, and as I'm going to show you, all these parameters will have different impacts on liquidity. So if we want to ask how liquidity affects something, actually we cannot ask that question. We need to be asking how these underlying parameters affect market liquidity. Okay? And I will be showing you just a few examples. And also we're going to see that relationship between price efficiency and economic efficiency will depend on what source of variation in liquidity we're using. It will be different. So let me go. I know I don't have that much time, and it's better to explain less to make sure that at least we understand something. Let me discuss one comparative static. Let's talk about this one. And this is what really a lot of, many papers spend a lot of time on this. Let's ask ourselves, what would happen to price and economic efficiency if we had more noise traders in the market? Okay? What we are showing here is that if we, for example, think about quadratic cost function, then there is no effect on price efficiency because things are symmetric. If you think about that option case, when the cost function is symmetric and quadratic, where activists can only create firm value, then more liquidity is good for economic efficiency. And what is the intuition? If there are more noise traders in the market, activists can accumulate, there is more uncertainty about how many shares activists is going to buy in the end. And firm value, which is option on that, will be more valuable just by convexity argument, right? So here, liquidity is definitely good for economic efficiency. Now, soon I'm going to show example when it's actually bad for economic efficiency. But what is really important is that in this example, in the quadratic cost function, liquidity is also good for price efficiency. Okay, so this is here we have liquidity has a positive effect on economic efficiency and price efficiency. Now, what is really nice in this slide, and this is why it's a little bit hard, is that the main result is something that you don't see here. What you don't see on this slide, initial toehold. So for very large set of production functions, we make this statement in this theorem. We can make these statements about the relationship between economic efficiency and price efficiency without asking what is initial toehold size. Why? Because the idea is basically is the following. As long as the convexity argument works, as long as firm value looks like an option on activist stake, more uncertainty about final position will always benefit economic efficiency. And we don't need to ask what is initial toehold size. This is one of major points from theoretical perspective. Now, the last thing that I want to say is that this is binary cost function. This is basically, if you want, those who are familiar, this is Morg and Coffee models in continuous time. The only thing that we changed is that instead of having one period trading model, we now make it continuous. As we're going, and our argument is that even then, many of intuitions that people have don't apply. For example, yes, if your initial toehold is small, then liquidity helps economic efficiency. You see the plus sign here. If your toehold is really large, liquidity hurts economic efficiency because you want to run, cut and exit. But the relationship between noise trading and liquidity is not monotonic. Basically, it's not just one-sided. Why? Because once your toehold is far from, if your toehold is far from the cutoff point where you either buy or sell shares, increases noise trading actually creates adverse selection, because now we know that if there are really many noise traders in the market, activists with even really small toehold can suddenly buy many shares and start changing firm value. So this is when market participants will start being worried about what if Carl Icahn gets from someone block of 7%. These are the cases what we have in mind. If activist is also having 10% and there is really a lot of liquidity, they're worried that maybe activists will not work hard and just dump it and go away. So let me summarize. What we have done basically is that we generalized activist technology in a dynamic model with continuous time trading, and we argued that the relationship between economic efficiency and price efficiency is, first of all, not always a function of toehold, initial toehold, which it basically overrules many existing papers. We argue that the relationship between many parameters and liquidity, it becomes not that obvious. So more noise trading does not necessarily mean that market will be more liquid. And why? Because we're endogenous value creation. We're saying that noise trading activity can make activists work harder. And this will make market participants worried about trading against these activists. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I have 10 minutes to try to explain this paper. First of all, I enjoyed it very much. I like theoretical papers, and I like good theory, and I like analytical solutions. I still have some remarks on how the paper is structured and what are the main results. So let's start first with my interpretation of the model. The model is actually relatively simple. It starts with the goals of an active trader. He has some goals. He wants to maximize his profits. So he understands that there is a cost to achieving some price, and the cost function is C of V. This is his cost function. I had very difficult time to understand how it is organized, whether it's a function of the value only or it's a pass function. It's still not completely clear to me. But one problem is, let's think about how the activist can create a value. I will suggest 3 alternatives, and let's see together which of them can fit this model. One alternative is, I recognize there is an overpaid manager. I would like to become a board member. I would like to fire him. It will save some cost to the company. Everybody will be happy. Then the problem is that following this strategy, I'm going to save a certain amount of money to the company. So I'm going to increase its value. So the function should be of the delta V, not V. In this case, I'm going to increase the value of the company by some number, not the final value. So this is the first approach, which is probably irrelevant to your model. The second option is, there is a company working on a drug, a new medicine, and I would like to create an alternative laboratory. I'm trying to investigate, and I will know before everybody else whether this drug is going to work. So in this case, I will be the first to know the true value of the company. And if I know the true value and I see that the current market price is above or below, I can definitely benefit from it. Also in this case, I can buy some shares, I can sell some shares, I can earn from this information. This will also not fit your model, since in this case, V is not a choice variable. It's not that activists will choose V, it's given. So it's also not in the scope of your model. And the third approach is that I'm an activist, and I know that when I try buying shares of the company, everybody will see, everybody know my name is well known, so everybody will recognize that I'm buying shares of the company. So slowly but surely, first market makers, then everybody else will recognize that probably something good or bad is going to happen, and the price will adjust. So this, in my opinion, is the right framework for your model. And here are some problems that I have. First problem is that, in my opinion, it's completely illegal. You cannot trade just when your goal is to change the value of shares. If you want to buy shares in order to own them, it's perfectly fine. But if the goal of your trade is to increase or decrease value of shares, I think it's illegal. Maybe it still happens, but this is the only framework that I can think for your model. Now then you go to the goal function, and the goal function is like G that you mentioned. If I have X% of the company, then the value of X% of the company V is this value. This is my cost function. I try to maximize the difference. So I know that when I have 7% of a big company, its value is 7% of its market value, and I have some costs. And then I have to find the last equation is what is the optimal value. So let's see a graph. So the red line is my holding of the company. This is my cost, and then I try to identify the maximum. This is the optimal value. So in your approach, in your model, the activist has to define what will be the optimal value of the company, and then he or she will try to buy or sell shares in order to bring everybody to this value. So this is the first part of your settings. Then it is not clear to me how do you take into account that the same activist has to unwind his position. Since it's not enough to show everybody that I'm buying more shares and the price is going up, at some stage I will have to sell. It's not part of your model. So you have to take this into account. Maybe it's somehow hidden in C of V, but since it is not defined, except some examples, it's difficult to say. So now we look at the path, how it happens. The activist is going to submit some orders. He has his initial holding. And this is a very important part of your paper. You show that this initial holding is in some cases irrelevant. In some cases, it is relevant. So he tries to buy or sell. And his initial holding has some expected value and some volatility. And then noise traders also come and they add some noise. And you consider the liquidity. Now, the liquidity effect can go in both directions. In one case, for an activist trader, it's much easier to buy or sell more shares when there is more liquidity. On the other hand, when there is a lot of liquidity and you're relatively small, it's very difficult to affect the shares. So these two effects come together, and this is why you have results positive in one area, negatives in others. Then you define the price function. Let me just go a little bit faster. The problem with the price function, it's again, it was not clear to me whether your price function is path dependent or path independent, since it looks like it just depends on the final state, and if you have illiquidity, it can be path dependent as well. So I will be happy if you can address this question. And then you arrive to some nice equations. I had very good time reading it. They look a little bit frightening, but the good part is that all have very nice solution. The solution is very simple. The solution is a linear function, and this is your trading strategy. And this is very nice to have an analytical solution. The problem is that, in my opinion, by using this analytical solution, you lose one very important point. And the point is, this is the solution you had. The trading strategy is a linear function. But the problem is that you have one variable which, in my opinion, is a key variable, and you cannot leave it unexplained. The final time. In your setting, the final time t is set in advance. As a result, I, as an active trader, cannot achieve my goal before t. Even if I collect the required number of shares, I keep trading till this time arrives. As a result, my trading strategy actually explodes. When t small comes very close to large t, and if I did not reach my goal yet, I will have to trade huge amount of shares. The second part of this disadvantage is that your key point is that your initial position in some cases is irrelevant. But keep in mind, no hedge fund was born with an initial position. Whether the position is initial or not is defined what you set as initial time point. And as soon as you fix the final time point, it's an arbitrary choice which day you define as initial point. Initially, every hedge fund has 0 position. So capital T must be endogenously included in your model. Otherwise, it's a very nice theoretical model, but in my opinion, it misses a very critical point of choosing the right time horizon. I had a brief conversation with you yesterday, and you absolutely correctly pointed that including T in these equations will make them totally unsolvable. You're probably right. And just as a small advice, maybe you can give up your optimization on V variable and just say that you know the right price. Maybe it will make the equations a little bit simpler. But again, in my opinion, it's very important to set T as a free variable and not to play with the value of the company that you try to maximize. Except for this, the model is very nice. I tried going through all the calculations and did most of them, not all. And I like the model. I have the intuition is very clear. The technical part is fortunately in the appendices. You can probably skip them. But the intuition is very nice. The model is very interesting. Thank you.
Anyone in the audience? Andrew in the back. Maybe there is a microphone. Maybe it's
Yes. You want to respond now to Can I respond first?
Yes, please.
Because it's okay. Okay, thanks so much Steve, for the good comments. Let me just address a few. First of all, about endogenous versus exogenous capital T, we thought about it, and so far, Kelly Beck is not able to solve it, which is a sign of how complicated it is. Again, we kind of think that we make one step at a time. In this paper, we take classical card and we introduce activism. I completely agree that in the future we need to bring it closer to, for example, 13Ds that people have in mind. This is where capital T is clearly important. And I'm open-minded if you have solutions. Good journals know about that. Now, I was a little bit confused by what you mean by it's illegal to change from value.
It's illegal to trade in order to change value.
This is what activists do. This is.
Are there any lawyers here?
There are lawyers here, and it's.
They don't
now,
scare us.
It's called manipulation.
No.
Buying things. Why anybody buys any asset.
Yes. Now, again, two more technical comments. Why price function was it price dependent or not? These are results from many years ago that it's sufficient to look just at cumulative order flow up to that point of time. You don't need to consider the history. It was shown early on. And in all these models also there is nothing after capital T, basically. There is no adverse selection. You can freely trade. You can unwind any position at cost. Of course, it would be interesting to start thinking whether there is any residual uncertainty, whether there is any residual adverse selection. But again, in all these models, including our one, it's just one period, very long period when they can trade. But from the point of view of activism, there is just one period, right? There are many trading periods, infinitely many, but there is one round of trading.
Can just one word. Just the previous paper, the paper we heard an hour ago, showed that the bid-ask spread went up significantly after the announcement.
This is
so
empirical
there is a
paper.
cost, and even it is nice in a theoretical paper say that it can be avoided, but there is a
No,
cost.
I'm not saying it can be. I'm just saying that we make one step forward at a time. But.
You have Andrew in.
Yes. Oh.
I really like this result that all we know about activism may not depend from a toehold point of view. And the benchmark paper that uses the MAUC 1998, so it's almost 20 years. And in 20 years, and your model has the black box or market microstructure, right? You have a market maker, information flows, so on and so forth. But in these 20 years, the market microstructure literature moved also to distinguish between two types of information. Information about the firm itself, and information about the order flow. And this is quite an innovative aspect of a market microstructure. That is, the trader may not know something about the firm itself, about information asymmetries that we are aware about, but he or she may know about something about the order flow. So the question that I have is whether, and in your model, if I understood correctly, the market maker is ambivalent toward this. So the question is going to be, if I introduce information about order flow, will it make it harder for the activist to reach his goal, given that the market maker is going to infer something about future future flows, order flow, from present order flow, and will adjust prices?
So let me answer in two steps. So I think what you have in mind is high-frequency traders who do business by front running and by knowing who will trade. In these models, market maker tries inferring everything about future order flow.
So these models about market microstructure are not about high frequency. They exist also in lower frequency.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say, in this model, market maker does make influence about order flow. All that influence is summarized in what was the cumulative order flow up to that point of time. But I think if you added market participants who drive front-running activists, of course it would make their life harder. You know? It would be harder for them to accumulate shares, and I think in that sense, presence of these market participants who are very aggressive and very good at predicting whether someone is buying a toehold. This model would say that it would definitely hurt economic efficiency, because then activists would buy smaller toeholds, the price would be higher, they would work less hard to change from that.
So let me start. So what you are saying that these results that you have are not based on, are based on the actions of front running made by other investors?
Yeah, there is no. There are noise traders, activists, and market makers. So there is no strategic, uninformed trader. Yes.
Any other comments? Very good. Thanks very much. So we have